Hi BookTube, welcome to another fiction review. Today we're going to look at a classic work of science fiction dating from the 1950s. It's a short fiction collection, but all the stories belong together. That is, each one is a piece of a whole. It's an attempt to sketch out the technological future of the United States. And in particular, it's looking at how are Americans going to move about? How mobile are they going to be? And it's got a real go-getting, no-fear kind of energy, which ironically places it more firmly in the time that it was written than in the future America as the author imagines it. Today we are looking at The Man Who Sold the Moon by Robert Heinlein. Published in 1955, there's no ISBN on my copy. Mine is from 1962. It's the second edition Pan Books paperback, 238 pages. Must tell you though, the Pan edition has very small print. It's 10 point, at least, it's single spaced. So it was that time. Books were printed for compactness more than for reading comfort. And so look out, if you are going to look out for a Pan Books edition, you've got to be aware that that's the kind of text you're going to get. There are Kindle versions available that would give you more flexibility in terms of print. And of course, there are numerous secondhand copies online. So do shop around if you are interested in this work. It is science fiction, hard science fiction. I believe Heinlein was considered to be the father of hard science fiction. That is, there is science in these stories. I did not find it myself really tricky to follow. Here and there might have been one thing where I thought, I'd need more information to really understand that, but not a great deal. I found it very easy to follow as a person who really never got past high school science. So if that's any comfort, that's all you have to deal with. Now, most of the owned books that I read, I then unhaul, unless there's a special reason why I should keep them. I take them to a local charity shop. This book, however, because it is a second edition, 1962 Pan Books reprint, and although it's old, my copy, it's not beat up. It's looking pretty good. There's a little bit of bumpiness on the bottom of the spine, but I read this edition with great care, because BookTube has taught me that many readers do value books as objects, and it's also taught me a little bit about what might be highly collectible. So I felt that this particular book needed to be passed on to a booktuber, and I reached out to Gareth at Book Songs and Other Magic, and I asked if he was interested. He was. And so Gareth, if you're watching, now that this review has aired, you can be sure that I'm going to be getting a parcel ready to send you this book. Let's talk about the author. This is another one of those authors where really reading a good biography would enhance any reading of their work. The best known Heinlein life story is in 2 volumes and is written by William H. Patterson. Patterson was a lifelong devotee of Heinlein's work, and he was chosen by Heinlein's widow to write that biography. But Robert Anson Heinlein was born in 1907 in Butler, Missouri, little tiny town about an hour's drive south of Kansas City. Heinlein was the third of 7 children. His family did not have the money to send him to college. His father was just an accountant, and with that many kids in the house, you can imagine. So Heinlein was very forward, and he petitioned his state senator to get him a place at the Naval Academy, and he got in. He qualified as an engineer, but he very quickly became more interested in trying to make his living writing fiction. And so his first story that was published was in 1939 in Astounding Science Fiction magazine. That was the story Lifeline. And altogether, he's written 32 novels, 59 short stories, and 16 collections of short stories. His last work, written in 1984, Job, A Comedy of Justice, was a satire about organized religion. I'm starting this section on the structure of the book with this chart that you might be thinking, what on earth is this? Well, before you reach the first story in the Pan Books edition, there is a 2-page spread with this timeline chart. I could not find an exact reproduction online, and I didn't want to photograph the one in the book because that would mean opening it up fully, and I was really, really wanting to be careful with the spine to keep the book in the same condition it was when I started reading it. But what I've got on screen here is a very close approximation. Heinlein's stories in The Man Who Sold the Moon are capturing significant technological developments and personalities in his imagined future United States. So along the left-hand side, you see I've highlighted the stories which appear in the collection. You cannot see the dates, which would be even further to the left. If you had the real chart, there would be dates. But my chart indicates that Heinlein imagined the events of these stories to be occurring between 1939 and 1999. For Heinlein, 1939 would also have been in the past, of course. And so the first story, Lifeline, which is the one he published in 1939, is fascinating because it speculates about a scientific development that was suppressed and that remained suppressed. When researching his biography, I found that Heinlein often speculated about human psychology and religion, and I would be interested to know if anyone has read Lifeline and knows of any later Heinlein stories which consider the social implications of that suppressed science, and whether it might have made a difference to the uglier things that were mentioned in Heinlein's timeline, but more about that later. Regarding the setting as a place, you could say, in air quotes, all stories are set in the continental United States. All the characters live there. They mostly travel within the United States, but now and again some characters have to travel internationally or off planet. But the setting, it's never more than a passing mention. At most, there might be a sentence of description. It really doesn't matter where the characters are physically for these stories. That's less important than where are they and how do they have a role in the technological changes that take place in these stories. The technology could be considered a character. The science could be considered a character. And I don't mean that there's any attempt to create artificial life. That's not what I mean. But it's the technological development and change are central. They're what drive, they're the focus of these stories. It's not the development of people, and it's not really the development of plot. And that's a feature of science fiction from the, let's say, the 1930s through to the 1970s, 80s. You could guarantee that the focus of the fiction was a concept of some kind. And that, for some readers, if you're not familiar with that, if you've been reading other kinds of genre fiction, you might find it strange that characters and plot seem to be somewhat secondary. They seem to be serving the conceptual focus rather than being themselves the focus of the stories. Setting in time. Well, there are no dates mentioned in The Man Who Sold the Moon, and I combed that book to be absolutely sure. There are precious few textual indicators to help the reader understand how much time is passing, where do we start, where do we end a story. The title story, which is also the longest, is divided into parts, and it's clear at the beginning of each part that some time has passed since the last one. But that's only because the characters, who are always discussing the technological developments that center the story, they describe things which were going to happen in the previous part as though they have now happened. Or they should have happened, except, something unpredicted changed the whole plan about what could and could not be done. If you didn't have the timeline chart, the only way you could date these stories is by noticing the technologies and or social behaviors which do not change. That's significant, but that's going to come up in a rabbit hole. Let's talk about narration. Narration in all these stories is third-person omniscient. In other words, the narrator could go inside any character's head, give you their viewpoint, let you see how they move around. You don't really take advantage of that, or Heinlein doesn't take advantage of that. Mainly, you stick with one focal character, and it's the one who's driving whatever technological development is the focus of their story. The narrator isn't godlike either. They don't take advantage of their omniscient powers. The reader isn't going to get much mind reading. Heinlein's narration it's closer to sound and video recordings, with the narrator only using their omniscience to describe something that a character notices, or a news report of some relevant action which happened when the characters were not present at that action. Dialogue dominates the page space, right? You're going to have to accept stories that are virtually all dialogue and then just slight descriptions of action or transition movements. And it's a kind of a replacement for narration. That's particularly true when the story needs to explain some scientific or engineering detail. You will get several paragraphs of dialogue, sometimes a character monologue, which is doing the explaining in place of several paragraphs of narration. And it means that the dialogue is unrealistic, and all dialogue is unrealistic in fiction, but there are degrees of non-realism. And I think, again, with this era of science fiction, I think you have to accept, because the concept is focal, because it's key, and not the characters and not the plot as such, although there are characters and there will be something of a plot, they're not central. And so less realistic dialogue is not the point. The point of the story is to unfold this concept for the reader fully so they can appreciate its implications. How might it impact society? How might it be developed? Where it might go? That's what matters. Number of characters is very small. Usually you spend most of your time with one, possibly two characters who are the primary driver of whatever the technological development is. The second character often acts like a partner or an assistant who's less technological. They have another strength that they bring to the partnership. They're differently qualified, let's put it like that. So they can't fully stand in for the primary character. After these two, you will get odd minor characters, anything up to 6. I think the longest story has 6. And their function is either to aid or to oppose the developing technology, whatever it is. Let's talk about mobility. I feel like I owe some kind of tribute to Elaine Castillo from her book, How to Read Now, to start to analyze this from the point of view of who is the expected audience. If we talk about mobility, in tribute to Elaine, it's important to say that the world outside the United States does not feel as though it actually exists. I mean, the United Nations is mentioned, so there you go. That is the headquarters in New York City. Not The Man Who Sold the Moon has the greatest number of mentions of other countries, but it's clear that territory in these countries is controlled by US interests somehow and used by them however they please. This aspect of Heinlein's stories identifies them with the early 1950s. It really does. And that high confidence post-war era where the United States could politically ignore the rest of the world. Curiously, Heinlein does not mention the Soviet Union. That's interesting. There could be, yes, very strong political reasons for that omission. The period between 1950 and 1955, that's the height of the McCarthy-driven paranoia about communist influence. And maybe Heinlein felt that he should just make sure that the existence of the Soviet Union, any mention of them, just should be left out of his stories, because then you have to, if you don't leave them out, you have to consider the Soviets as major technological rivals. And that might be misconstrued by McCarthy's minions. I don't know who he had looking out for all these artistic clues to possible communist affiliation, but that was happening. And so I could understand if Heinlein thought, I'm just going to pretend it's not there. That makes my book safe for my publishers and safe for me. You know, it doesn't impact my career in any way. In Heinlein's defense, however, I mean, he does take a moment in the longest story to poke fun at one of his American characters, you know, who's so isolated from anything outside America, he doesn't know the reality of the places that he visits. This is from The Man Who Sold the Moon, and it describes the character called Delos Harriman. He's the primary driver of the story, and he's on a visit to the Netherlands to meet with diamond merchants. Harriman liked the Low Countries. He was delighted to discover a dog-drawn milk cart whose young master wore real wooden shoes. He happily took pictures and tipped the child heavily, unaware that the setup was arranged for tourists. Representation. Also in tribute to Elaine Castillo's book, Heinlein's stories are about white Americans creating and using their technology. Characters are referred to mainly by surnames, and almost all of these are European. There were a couple of Spanish surnames, and they clearly were people with wealth. So I thought, okay, are these Latino, Filipino, or European Spanish? And I opted for European Spanish. I suspected that. And that's only because Latino and Filipino characters are labeled the two times that individual characters appear who are not European. They're very clearly described. So, for example, in the first story, Lifeline, the primary driver character, has an elderly maidservant named Angela who speaks Spanish and refers to her employer as the master. So, hired servant there, but possibly Latino. That doesn't actually say. The first story may be set in time prior to 1955. So that one takes place in the 30s. The second story, Let There Be Light, mentions, and I'm quoting now, a nervous Filipino salad boy working in the kitchen of a diner. And the fourth story, Blow Ups Happen, there is a black waiter named Israfel, shortened to Izzy, working at a bar in Reno, Nevada, and he earns tips from his wealthy white clientele if he can roll higher rolls of dice than they do. That's how he makes extra money in addition to his salary. During his one conversation with two customers, he's accused of cheating to get those higher rolls. So, make of that what you will. The accusation is not followed up, but the only reason the characters don't follow it up is they have so much spare cash, they don't view the accusation as important enough to pursue. Let's talk about problematic content. I suppose the only thing that will be problematic with Heinlein's imaginations of the future United States is that business of representation in all its facets. There will be a link in my description box to an article written by G.E. Rule. It came out in 2003, and it's talking about female and non-white characters in Heinlein's fiction more broadly, going beyond just this book. Rule does show that Heinlein, though he creates a number of strong women who are the intellectual equals of their male counterparts, or sometimes their intellectual betters, typically it includes an evaluation of the woman's appeal as a sexual object as well. So she needs to be described in physical detail, which suggests that the expected reading audience is male and heterosexual and wants that additional information about female characters, even where it has no bearing at all on the technological development in the story. So female readers might find that frustrating. They might also find it a bit testing, the depiction of wives. The number of times that they're just unheard voices or unseen at the other end of a telephone conversation with their husband. They rarely make a personal appearance. Wifely dialogue in this book was always argumentative and expressing a desire to know when they could expect to see their husbands, because it was pretty clear that they often didn't. And then there was frustration and there was ignorance. The women did not understand the nature of the work their men were doing or what pressures they faced. They weren't brought into the picture at all. The men never thought about their wives unless interrupted by one of those argumentative phone calls, never seemed to have a life that included their wife. One character actually planned a major life change, like moving house, without consulting his wife at all. And when confronted by her, he simply ordered her to accept what he had already decided. And that will kind of feed into my rabbit hole here, because all that detailed looking at representation and problematic content, it shows how narrowly Heinlein focused, that he was focused on the science as it might move forward, but not on any other area of society. And sometimes even other areas of technology. There were still characters using typewriters when they were, and I thought, okay, well, things might have moved on, or other types of technology. You think, no, that will have, but again, this is because that really the only way to create an alternative future that doesn't exhaust you is you kind of have to choose your focus. If we just consider the technical details of Heinlein's stories, these details are engaging, even when, with the advantage of hindsight, yes, we know that those technologies didn't progress the way Heinlein quite imagined them. I enjoyed the details very much, and I enjoyed the timeline with its broad outline of the developments Heinlein imagined for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st a bit as well. But I would compare my enjoyment of Heinlein's stories with the enjoyment I get from nonfiction rather than fiction. And I guess I better explain that a bit more. I'll be reading from my notes now, so bear with me if I look down a bit more. But this is the quirky quality that I found with older forms of hard science fiction. The details of the concept are extremely interesting, yeah? The stories, however, they fit really awkwardly around that central concept. And so my question is always, and particularly with Heinlein's work, why are these presented in the framework of stories rather than as articles or essays? That's what's always a question mark for me. The fictional framework of Heinlein's stories, the stories, they fit so imperfectly around the science. They seem to be really odd containers for the message he wants to communicate, because the fiction is underdeveloped in comparison, right, to the technological idea. The fiction is clearly secondary, kind of in the same way that the people and places mentioned in the fiction are secondary to the technological concept. Now, what I can understand, if I think of it from a marketing advertising point of view, how is the best way to present scientific and technological data? I would choose a fictional framework too, because if I want to reach a lot of people in a popular audience, think about it. The man who sold the moon, for example, there's a character named Montgomery who looks after the promotion for his firm, and it's aiming to achieve the first moon landing. And in the story, he employs all kinds of media, directly and indirectly, and you've got to admire his talent for creating fictions, if nothing else. And the result is a raising of general public consciousness about the potential of the moon as the next place to be, the moon as the next place from which to do business. So if I consider this science fiction as a form of popular consciousness raising, the marketing of a technological vision, then the odd lopsided partnering of all this scientific detail with a clunky fictional narrative, it makes sense. It makes sense. And I think of the 1950s and the 1960s as a time when those kind of messages had their most receptive audience. One of the reasons I need to read more science fiction is to have enough knowledge to assess how the presentation of hard science fiction compares now. Like, I haven't read much more recent science fiction, maybe 1 or 2 books. I've read mostly older science fiction works. And when I say mostly, that's still not a lot of books. So I get the impression that readers of science fiction demand more from their authors now. So maybe they're demanding a quality of narrative that is as good as the science being described. So that's something that I'll look forward to finding out. And that's my review done, guys. I've really got to get myself all caught up with new scripts. I've just finished the book Why We Sing, by Julia Hollander. Yes, it was one of the books, Gareth, if you're watching again, because you might be, it's one of the books that you had on the Belief and Behavior book club. I happened to own it already before you started the club. I didn't buy it especially but I just reached a point where I thought it was so attractive and I had to read it. So what I'm hoping you'll get next is a nonfiction review of that book. Everyone, I hope you're doing well. I know a lot of people have said that end of January, beginning of February, because of the weather in different places, and I think I'm talking mainly Northern Hemisphere, everybody's struggling and feeling a bit sort of weighted by various other things outside our own lives. But hang in there, everybody, I guess is all I could say. Read your books, because books help, among many other things. But take care of yourself however you can. And I'll see you again in a few days' time. Bye-bye.